Okay, so this presentation will be pretty quick. There aren't any new diagrams. This is just another clarifying point. It should be quite brief on the notion of wild and why I chose that word to capture the stage of poetic development above the wrought poetry that scholars create, which is the predominant strain in English poetry currently in terms of what the establishment itself is celebrating and producing. There is beneath that, there is whim poetry, which is created by the more sentimental types, which is the Instagram poets and things like that, who are not being celebrated by the establishment, but who have a larger readership because they are closer in development to the masses. If you're just watching this third video and you haven't watched the first two, it might be worth just going over them and getting a bit of a feel and grounding in what I'm talking about, because I lay it all out there quite in a logical kind of sequence, and I try to kind of do it justice there. So the wild strain in English poetry, this is partly, I think, a title that came to me that captures what I had been reading at the time, relatively recently, from Sri Aurobindo's work Future Poetry, in which he talks about there being two drives in the English poetry sort of field tradition. One is the Anglo-Saxon fidelity to nature and action. It's an external kind of poetics, and we see a lot of poets trying to do that, even the more subjectively lyrically inspired poets moving in that direction, and trying their hand at stage plays and things like that. Like Yeats himself did this, Keats did this, I believe Tennyson did this, Wordsworth did this. It's something that they are trying to evidently do. They feel called to do. It's a part of the collective English sort of psyche. And it is what Shakespeare also included in his work. It wasn't only external action, but he did have. That's why we call him a mirror. That's why we say of him that he held a mirror up to nature, because he was able to capture the externals so well, and also the internal, which is the second point, the second drive in the in English poetry, which is more of the fidelity, the Celtic fidelity, not Anglo-Saxon, but the more Celtic, I would say, drive or fidelity to what is divined, which is it's anchored in something spiritually more real and richer. And English poetry has always kind of had a bit of both drives in it, and that's what Shakespeare, he was sort of the consummation of the marriage of the two in a seamless whole. And so it was with that in mind that I came up with the name of wild poetry as the step above the scholarly kind of work that's been produced for a long time by the establishment. So if you've watched the first two videos, you'll be aware of what I've been calling the developmental ontological map, that we need a map of development that tracks levels of being or psychological development and levels of knowing or levels of ontology. Wild poetry, with that name, I'm trying to gesture at both the development and the ontology, the material that they are working with, these kinds of poets, who I've called senses. So the wild, so let's deal with first the level of being. So I've called it wild because if you recall my in my previous presentation, I showed how the masses, the sentimentals, and the scholars all have they're kind of anchored in the mudra center, or in the life of instincts, which is another way of saying that they have a conventional belief system, values system, and it's and that's why, even though the scholar is drawing on a much wider tradition of beliefs and values than the mass man might, it's still ultimately contiguous with the same worldview and framework. And the scholar still freezes reality and deals with it at a distance. And he freezes this because there's a few different things going on there, but one of them is it's the nature of the mind, the lower mind that he's using, which only sees things in parts and doesn't see them in context. So the censor, stands for something else. He stands for something different. He no longer shares the same value or belief system, and so that's what I'm trying to connote with the word wild, as far as his level of being is concerned. The level of knowing is I'm also trying to get at here, because wild, I think, also captures the nature of essence, which is what he is working with, or she. It is, in other words, it isn't something that has been civilized and digested and metabolized by the vast cold machinery of the tradition that is born out of the analytical mind. Okay, so it's not a part of that already digested mass of dead thought forms. He is trying to speak into being the living reality or truth of what he is in contact with. Okay, so he's a voice of reality, basically. And that is always going to be, I think, wild, because it, by definition, isn't the thing that has been metabolized by convention, and by the mass or the body of civilization, you could say, in a way. So, to further clarify these 2 points, I've got 2 quotes here, and then I'll wrap up the presentation, and that should be it. The first is that I think Ted Hughes articulates this quite well. I think he himself is aspiring towards, and sometimes accomplishes. I haven't read much of his work though, but just based on what I've read of his Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being book, it seems as though he is in this category of censors, writing wild poetry. So he says in his book, Poetry in the Making, all imaginative writing is to some extent the voice of what is neglected or forbidden. I don't know about all imaginative writing. Maybe I would just add in all truly imaginative writing is to some extent the voice of what is neglected or forbidden. Because the voice of what is uncivilized, not as uncivilized in the sense of just uncontrollable lust or instinct, but uncivilized as in the voice of reality, which people, we know this, want to shut out because they want things to proceed along the lines of their conventional belief systems and value system. And so he is, the poet, she is something of a shamanic figure, you could say. He, at any rate, someone who can speak the truth. Not the conventional desecration of truth, which is freezed desiccated, mangled into what is acceptable and palatable for those with a conventional value system, the scholars, the sentimentals, and the masses. But something real that has some teeth, something that's outside the confines of civilization. And that is essentially what I am trying to do in my writing as well. And so it's interesting that I'm trying to... I could talk, and I have been talking from the third-person perspective about what this is, but I could also just talk from a first-person perspective about the nature of wild poetry and wild poets, because that's the point. It should feel a little... It naturally feels jarring to listen to someone actually say they have a connection to something more real. Immediately, if we have a conventional system, we're threatened by it, and we want to move immediately to some kind of discrediting of that, a reducing of that, a dismissing, a ignoring of that, and that quality is what I'm trying to put your finger on right now, so that you can sort of feel the tension there and the strain there. Society doesn't really make a room for that space, which is why it is all the more important for that fact. And that in itself is an interesting question. Why is it so important to be able to speak what is neglected or forbidden? Because we need what is real, because it actually is nourishing in a way that the fake things cannot be. It's nourishing in a way that there are many people who need it, and I think ultimately that's what poets should be aiming to do. Reality or essence is one of those things that seems to be, in the moment that it is spoken, threatening, which is why geniuses like Shakespeare and Blake often get Blake completely ignored. Shakespeare, I would say, in a curious way, ignored as well, not exoterically. His outlandish kind of plots and everything like that, it was celebrated, and he was he was quite successful. But esoterically, all of his wisdom, I don't think was really appreciated or seen, and still, in a way, hasn't been. And so, what I'm trying to say, I forget the train of thought I was going down. Essentially, we just need... I think in our society, we need to have that ability to... we need to have a space where poets can speak something more real, because geniuses are going to be ignored in the moment, and this is where I was going. But then it's usually down the track, 50 years, 100 years, 200, 300 years, when people are ready and are needing that something real, it's there for them to grow into and start to digest and absorb the nutrients of. And so, it's curious. I think as a field, poetry needs to not only cater for where the majority of its members are at, which is the scholar stage, and because currently it is essentially trying to create that which will be of sustenance and need for the masses in however many years' time. But it really needs to... We need a poetic framework, and that's what I'm proposing, that has a higher ceiling on it for those who are ready to move in that direction. so that we can start to take into account a wider swath of humanity. So I think that's it. So, and then that brings us to the final point. Exuberance is beauty. Blake, and I think I've even written as much in my epic poem on Blake, which is a conversation between Blake and myself. That's how it's structured. And there's a part where Blake and I sort of do create a poem together, a song together, or a hymn, if you will, on the nature of the bard. And the bard is something that is wild by nature, because it's a consciousness that isn't civilized, and it's much older, and that's what wisdom is. And so that, I think that's what Blake means when he talks about exuberance. Exuberance is that which doesn't follow the traditional confines of form, and the traditional and expected confines of form, because that's small and narrow. It's operating according to its own much more encompassing laws of its spirit. And so wild poetry is contiguous with wisdom poetry. And that's where I think that's a good place to leave it. Maybe I'll just end with a small note on wisdom poetry, which is just that they to me seem a bit more like shamanic figures who have achieved a wisdom that allows them to communicate to the masses. That's not necessary, because I don't think Blake was intending to do that, but Shakespeare and Dante in a way were, as was Goethe. But it's just something interesting to note, that they are able to kind of carry notes of those three that I mentioned, carried notes of all the different kinds of poetry in them, so that there's something for everyone to relate to. But Blake actually disliked this, and he said true art is allegory addressed to the intellectual powers denied to the corporeal understanding. He wanted to, in other words, deny people that were going to desecrate it the opportunity to do so. But I think that wraps up this part of this third presentation. So again, thanks for listening.